The driver kept the radio low and asked an easy question about the weather. We turned onto my block, and the cab rolled to a stop in front of the mailbox with my name in black letters that had chipped at the edges. I stood on the sidewalk a moment and took in the house Linda and I had bought 3 decades ago. Then I saw the suitcase. I reached for the doorknob and felt the first wrong thing. The lock had been changed. Footsteps came from inside and the door opened to the length of the chain. Emily looked at me through the gap. She said that I should not be on the steps in the cold and that I had scared her knocking like that. I said I need to come in. The chain stayed on. She told me that I cannot live here anymore. She said the house is not safe for me alone and that after the hospital the doctor had said I should not put myself at risk. I told her that this is my home. Emily said that she and Jason have been talking and that it is time for a plan. In that box, she had pinned the stub from the movie we took her mother to see on a hot July in '98. The tiny brass key from the first apartment we shared, the 10-cent stamp from a letter I sent from a job in Peoria when I was too tired to drive home. I said I need to come in. Emily said it is not a good idea. The chain clicked and the door closed. I heard the deadbolt slide into place. I stood and listened to the sound of my own breath and a car passing and the echo of the latch in the quiet house beyond. I bent and picked up the suitcase. I set it down again because my chest tugged with a dull reminder, and I followed the advice from the paper in my pocket and took a slow breath. I had meant to do that before the hospital. The list of small things you notice when a big thing crowds them out starts to feel like a kind of grace. The right front step had a loosened nail. The gutter at the corner hung by a screw that was not mine. I watched my own breath and counted to 5, and then did it again the way the nurse had taught me to calm the flutter. I sat on the top step, and the wood felt familiar under me in a way nothing else did. I thought about calling Sarah, and then I did not. I did not want to hear a kind voice and feel my throat close. I took the phone from my pocket and looked at the battery and put it away again. The plastic bag with the pill bottles crinkled a little in the wind, and the yellow of the labels looked bright against the gray day. Emily opened the door a crack again and said that I should not sit out here in the cold. She said I would make myself sick. She said she would call me later to make sure I ate something. She did not open the chain. She said I would find a ride if I needed one, and that the hospital could arrange transport if I called. She said she was sorry, and that this is hard, and that she needs me to try to understand. Then she closed the door once more and the house was a quiet shape, with my name on the mailbox, but no way inside. I picked up the suitcase and the bags and carried them down the steps, one at a time. The weight pulled at my side and I paused on the sidewalk and set everything down and waited until the ache softened. A boy on a bicycle rode past with his hood up and his breath puffing, and he looked at me the way children look at grown men who do not fit the picture they hold in their heads. I raised a hand, and he nodded and kept going. I walked to the curb and stood where the nurse had left me hours before. I called for a cab and the dispatcher told me it would be 10 minutes. I thanked her and hung up and stood with my suitcase and the bag with my shaving kit and the plastic tub with the belt Linda used to call my tail because it followed me everywhere. I thought of all the times I had walked up those steps with groceries or lumber or a bouquet of yellow daisies because Linda said yellow is a brave color. I thought of the morning we brought Emily home from the hospital and the afternoon we carried in the tree for her 3rd Christmas and how she clapped her hands when the lights came on. I thought of 1,000 small moments that had built a life one nail and one board and one laugh at a time. The cab pulled up and the driver leaned across to unlock the back door. He asked where to, and I told him to take me to the corner of 5th and Maple, and then I changed my mind and told him to wait while I figured it out. He said, "Take your time," and he meant it. I looked back at the house and at the porch, where the swing moved a little, and at the front window where Linda used to press the heel of her hand to the glass, to wipe away the fog and make a circle to see the snow. My chest drew tight again, not with pain, but with something else, something larger and colder that did not have a word small enough to carry it. I put the suitcase in the back seat and climbed in and pulled the door closed gentle, as if closing it soft might make the sound less final. The driver asked again where I wanted to go. I told him to take me somewhere warm. He laughed a little and asked if I meant a diner or a hotel. I told him a diner would do fine. He nodded and eased the cab away from the curb. The house slid past the window, and the oak branches sliced the white sky into pieces that did not fit together. In the reflection on the glass, I saw a man with hospital tape marks still on his wrist, and I saw the porch swing, and I saw the suitcase that had never looked so much like a stranger. I watched until the street bent away, and then I turned my eyes to the road ahead and told myself to breathe in and out, and count to 5 and do it again. The cab took me to Maple Street Diner because the driver said it was warm and always open, and I did not have a better idea than warm and open. A waitress with silver hair and a name tag that said Ruth set down a menu and told me I looked like I needed coffee first. I told myself to eat something. Ruth suggested chicken noodle, and I nodded. I did not want to bring her into this until I knew which parts of this were real and which parts were my fear talking. I told the driver to take me back to 5th and Maple, and when we reached the corner, I told him I was good from there. Through the front window, I could make out the shape of the living room. The old armchair Linda loved was gone. A man I did not know crossed the room carrying a tape measure and a pad. The side door opened and Jason stepped out onto the porch with a phone to his ear. Jason saw me halfway up the walk and said that I should not be on my feet and that Emily would be upset if I overdid it. He told me he was getting the house ready for safety and for what he called a fresh start. He said clutter is a hazard and that the place needs staging if we are going to do what is best for everyone. I asked him where Linda's things were going. He told me he was storing everything carefully. He said the old chair had springs that stuck through and that rugs are a trip risk for someone after a hospital stay. He said the shadow box was dated and that buyers like clean lines. He told me he had already arranged for painting a neutral tone. I told him that I do not need bigger. I need true. He said the house is too much and that Emily was a wreck at the hospital and that today had been hard on her and that the best thing I could do is rest and let them handle things. The light was on and the counters were bare. The window was empty now. A plastic tub sat on the table with a strip of blue tape and black marker letters I could not read from the porch, but I knew what they would say. Jason followed my eyes and told me not to worry about the small stuff. He said memories are not objects. He told me he would arrange storage and that once things settled, we would take a look together. I stepped away. I told him I needed one thing from the house. I asked him to let me take the shadow box. He said that item was already packed and that he would make sure it stayed safe. He said the insurance is complicated and that chain of custody is important. He said he would be liable if anything happened. The man with the tape measure returned and asked Jason about light fixtures. Jason told him to remove the brass pendant in the dining room. He told the man to pull the curtains and leave the rods. He said all personal materials need to be boxed. He said, this is not a family shrine. I took a step back because my chest pulled again, and I remembered the doctor saying, take it easy, and I remembered the nurse showing me how to breathe when the flutter starts. Jason watched me and said I was proving his point. He said he would call me tomorrow, and we would go over accommodations and maybe paperwork that would make things simpler for everyone. He told me to get some rest. I looked at the place where Linda used to kneel to wipe muddy dog prints off the floor. I looked at the corner where the Christmas tree always leaned a little, no matter how I turned the stand. I looked at the porch swing moving just enough to say the wind was present. I thought about the day Linda and I stained that swing and how our fingers were brown for a week, and she called it a souvenir of work well done. I asked Jason one quiet question. I asked him whether he could see anything here as a person sees a church rather than a product. He gave me the smile that means no. I picked up my bag because I needed to make a choice that would not break me before I found a way to stand. I told Jason I would be in touch. He told me he was glad to hear me say that, and that we would make this transition smooth. He turned to the man with the pad and began to talk about timelines. The side door closed behind them, and the porch light clicked on after a second, as if it had been set to a new schedule. I walked back to the corner, and the sky had turned the color of nickel. A train horn carried from far off, and the winter air made it sound lonelier than it needed to be. I took out my phone and opened a blank message to Sarah and stared at the empty field. My thumb hovered, and I wrote 3 words and deleted them and wrote 2 others and deleted those too. I put the phone away and held the paper bag from the diner and felt the weight of the slice Ruth had tucked in, as if she knew there would be a moment when sugar might keep a man upright. I stood there a long time until the porch light across the street clicked off again. Then I turned toward Maple and walked slowly, counting each breath, telling myself to reach the next corner and then the next, because sometimes a life is kept together by nothing fancier than a series of small distances you manage to cross. I need my wallet and my social security card and the file folder from the desk. I will arrange a civil standby with police in the morning to pick them up. Leave the things in a box on the porch. I dialed the non-emergency police line and asked about a civil standby for the morning. The dispatcher said an officer could meet me at the address at 9. I said my daughter had changed the locks while I was in the hospital and put my belongings on the porch. The phone vibrated on the bedspread. I almost did not answer when I saw the name. Grace. The smile in my granddaughter's voice hit me before the words did. Grandpa Mom says you are with Uncle Frank, but I do not think that is true. Are you mad at me? I took a breath and made it calm. Never at you. She said Mom is mad all the time now. She says grown-ups need space. She says your room is going to be an office. She says a lot of things. The last sentence tumbled over itself like it wanted to hide and be seen at the same time. How was school? I said, because it steadies a child to be asked about the small boats they sail each day. She told me about a diorama and a girl who cried at recess and a music teacher who let them try the triangle. Then she whispered that she put the picture of me and her in her sock drawer so no one could call it clutter. I closed my eyes against that and saw her last summer at the kitchen table, elbows out, tongue between her teeth, as she colored a sun that refused to stay inside the lines. Tell me about your diorama, I said. She did for a full minute without coming up for air. When she paused, I said, I will see you soon. She said, will you be here for the science fair? I said yes, and tasted the risk of promising anything when your life has just fallen through its own floor. She said, I love you, and hung up fast like a child who knows someone might take the phone if she lingers. I sat there, with the phone still warm in my hand, and let gratitude and fury argue in the space behind my ribs until both wore themselves down. I called one more number. A woman answered on the second ring. Dad, she said, and I forgot for a second how to breathe, because I had not heard Ella say that in almost a year. The apology I had owed her sat heavy in my mouth, but pride is a strange animal. It knows how to block the exit when the right words try to leave. I kept it simple. I am in town. I need a favor. She was quiet for a beat that felt longer than honesty. "Where are you?" I told her the motel. She asked if I was safe. I said safe enough. I said there was a situation with Emily. I stopped before I said more, because the last thing I wanted was to use one daughter to attack the other, even if one of them had taught me how deep disappointment could run. Ella said, "Do you need me to come there?" The part of me that still wanted to look like a father said no. The part of me that remembered her at 12 with a fever and a book in her lap while she pretended to read so she would not worry me said yes. I settled on tomorrow. "Civil standby at 9, I said. "If you can meet me, I would be grateful." She said, "Text me the address." She did not ask for details. She did not ask why I had not called sooner. She did not ask who changed the lock or who set my suitcase on a porch like it belonged to a stranger who had missed a flight. She just said, "I will be there," and "good night," and we let that be enough for one call. Sleep did not come. Not at first. The heater rattled, and the neighbor's television leaked through the wall in bursts of laughter that made no sense without the setup. I took my evening pills and lined the bottle next to the water glass like a guard at ease. I wrote a list on the back of my discharge paper. Wallet card, birth certificate, marriage certificate, tax file, tool roll, photo box, watch, Scout's vet records. The dog's name drew a line through me. Emily had said she would rehome him while I was in the hospital because it was too much. I swallowed hard against that and added one more line. Scout, if possible. Somewhere between the 5th and the 6th time I checked the alarm, the city settled into the kind of quiet that makes you believe things might be rebuilt if you move carefully. I turned off the lamp. The dark had weight, but not malice. I listened to my breath and counted to 5, and then did it again until the bird in my chest folded its wings and rested. Ella's mouth moved toward a line that looked like mine when I am holding back more words than are helpful. I could feel my pulse quicken. I asked the officer if I could collect the tool roll and the watch from the bedroom dresser if someone brought them to the door. He said that was reasonable. Emily disappeared inside. Jason stayed. He shifted his weight and told the officer that he hoped this was all clear and simple. The officer said, "Clear and simple is better than the other kind." Jason forced a smile that showed more teeth than warmth. I felt the stare before I saw her. Grace stood in the second-floor window with her hands on the glass and her cheeks pale against the cold light. She looked at me the way a child looks at the sure thing in a room gone strange. She lifted one hand and laid it flat against the pane. I raised mine and held it in the air where she could see. For a second, it felt like we had built a bridge out of nothing more than 2 palms and the memory of summer chalk on a sidewalk. Then a curtain moved, and she was gone. Emily returned with the tool roll and the old brass watch that had been in my father's pocket before it was in mine. She handed them to the officer who handed them to me. The watch felt like a small heartbeat. The leather of the tool roll smelled like work and afternoons that took their time. I eased them into the bin and closed the lid with a click that sounded too final. The officer said we were done for today. Emily said she would be in touch about next steps. Jason said he would email a list. Ella thanked the officer and told him we appreciated his time. He nodded and walked back to his car and sat with the engine running and the radio low. The cold had crept into my fingers, and I rubbed them together the way Linda used to when the first frost came. Ella opened her trunk. She lifted the bin like a person who knows her own strength and knows when to use it. I placed my small bag beside it. We were about to close the trunk when Emily came down the steps and stood on the walk with her arms at her sides. She said she had done what had to be done because my health mattered and because I refused to see reason. She said the house was too big, and the stairs too steep, and the risks too high. She said if something happened to me, she would not be able to forgive herself. She did not cry, she did not need to. She wore conviction like a uniform. Ella waited until she had finished. Then she told her that there are ways to help that do not start by changing locks while a person is lying in a hospital bed. She said that respect is its own kind of medicine. She said that love without respect becomes control wearing a mask. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The words landed where they were aimed. We drove in silence for a few blocks. The heater in Ella's car breathed warm air that smelled faintly of winter boots and school paper. At the third light, she reached over and touched the back of my hand with one finger, like she was testing a wire. I told her I was sorry. The words came out small and late and heavy. I said I had always leaned toward Emily because she reminded me of Linda, and because I had confused familiarity with goodness. I said I had made it hard to be the daughter who did not ask for much. I said I had a long list of mistakes, and that most of them had her name on the line where the damage landed. Ella kept one hand on the wheel and one on the edge of the console. She told me that she had made her own choices about distance and about quiet and about survival when a house loves one person more loudly than another. She said she had built a good life with a small apartment and a classroom and students who liked to read out loud. She said she would help me because helping is what a person does when someone they love is being pulled under. She said we would take this one step at a time, and that the first step was to put the bin in her living room and make a list we could live with. At her place, she cleared space on the rug, and we set the bin down and opened it together. The marriage certificate with the coffee stain, the photographs, the cards, the watch, the tool roll. She touched the photograph of Linda and smiled with the kind of grief that has had time to learn how to sit. I felt the old ache rise and then settle. Ella made tea like she was performing a small ceremony for a guest who needed to remember what warmth felt like from the inside out. We talked about practical things, a lawyer, a doctor's letter, a plan for where I would sleep that was not a motel where the heater sounded like it might decide to stop and never start again. She said I could have the couch until we found something better. I started to protest and she lifted a hand and I stopped. Sometimes a father does not argue when his child is right. When the tea was gone and the list had more items on it than I wanted, we sat in a quiet that felt like air after a storm. Ella said she was proud of me for showing up. I said I was proud of her for standing where she had every right to leave. She laughed once, short and honest, and shook her head at me like a woman who has decided to forgive a man in stages so he learns what each stage is worth. I told her I needed a few minutes alone and she nodded and slipped into the kitchen. I took Linda's photograph in both hands and studied the light caught in her hair that afternoon by the lake. I told her under my breath that I had been a foolish man and that I was ready to learn a new way. I set the photo back on the stack and breathed the way the nurse taught me and the way life keeps teaching you when you think you already learned. Ella returned with a blanket and laid it over the arm of the couch without comment. Outside, the light leaned toward afternoon. Somewhere a neighbor dragged a garbage can to the curb, and a dog barked twice and then thought better of it. We had a plan that was not perfect and not complete, but it was ours. I closed my eyes for a moment and let the warmth from the tea and the blanket and the presence of my daughter soak into the places that had gone cold. Ella left for school early with a travel mug and a stack of papers held under her arm like a shield. Take medication with food. Avoid stress. Mark Johnson still had the same cell number he has had since phones began to fit into pockets. He asked if I was all right. I said I had been better and worse and that I could use his eyes on a situation I did not trust my own eyes to see clean. He told me to come by his office at 11. He said he had a closing at 10:30 and that I could wait in the conference room if he ran over. I told him I would be there. Then the conference room door opened, and he was there, the same strong jaw and kind eyes and a tie that never quite lays flat. We shook hands and sat. I told him the short version. Locks changed. When I said Emily held up a photocopy of a power of attorney with my name in a shape that looked like mine and was not, his mouth made a small line. He asked if I had ever signed a power of attorney. I said no. He asked if I had ever discussed one. I said not with anyone who spelled my name. He asked if Emily had shown me a notarized original. I said she had not. He asked if there was a mortgage. I said the balance was small. He asked for the legal description if I knew it. I said I did not. He asked for any documents I had brought. I slid the bin items across the table, chose the folder with our tax returns, the marriage certificate, the birth certificate, my wallet. He asked about witnesses. I told him about the officer, and about Ella, and about a man with a clipboard, and a crew carrying out boxes labeled in a hand that did not belong to anyone in my family. He asked if I had seen any listing photos or online activity. I shook my head and said I had seen a room without Linda's shadow box, and that was enough. Then he said he wanted to check one thing before we went further. He told me there was a petition filed late yesterday afternoon. He said it was a request for temporary guardianship of the estate and possibly of the person. He said the petitioners were Emily Miller and Jason Miller. He said they had attached a statement about my hospitalization and a letter from a doctor unsigned in the copy claiming concern about cognitive decline. He said they had also requested an emergency order that could be granted ex parte if the judge found immediate risk. I asked what immediate risk meant in a room like this. He said it meant they claimed I could not manage my affairs and that property might be lost or misused if someone did not step in. He said we would need a current letter from my cardiologist stating I was competent to make my own decisions. He said we would also record a notice with the recorder of deeds to flag the property so no one could transfer title without a loud bell going off in the title office. I asked if a person can invent a letter from a doctor. He said anyone can invent anything, but courts prefer the kind of paper that arrives on letterhead with a date and a signature and a phone number that picks up when you call. I told him David Brooks at Memorial. He told me we would also send a preservation letter to Jason if he was acting as an agent in any potential sale, instructing him not to list, show, or alter anything until the matter was resolved. I said Emily believes she is right. I said she has always moved through the world like a person with a plan, and I have always followed the sound of that confidence because it sounded like Linda when she was sure about a paint color or a road to take. He said, believing you are right is not the same thing as being allowed to break the law. He said, love is not a power of attorney, and concern is not a deed. Dr. Letter. Emergency motion to oppose guardianship and to deny temporary orders. I said Karen White from the flower shop could say I placed and signed an order last week, that I read the invoice and corrected her when she misread the subtotal, that I joked about how lilies smell like churches, and she laughed. He said human details matter because judges are people forced to read too much paper. He asked about my granddaughter. I said Grace is 10 and keeps a picture of me in her sock drawer so no one calls it clutter. I told him I would stand in front of anything before I let my granddaughter carry it. He filled out the form and slid it under my hand so I could sign. The clerk stamped it with a satisfying smack and told us to have a nice day in the voice of someone whose whole job lands on the nice day of other people. He told me to take it to the office in person if I could, and to be the man who waits in the hall without complaint. He said doctors are human and human beings respond to presence. He also asked his assistant to search Jason Miller through the state licensing portal. Licensed broker since 2013. A citation 2 years ago for advertising a property without written permission, resolved with a fine and continuing education. He said an immediate letter would go to the managing broker and the insurance carrier. He said he would not accuse anyone of anything he could not prove. He said he would simply remind them what happens when a license holder touches a property without authority. He put a hand on my shoulder and said the hardest part of these cases is not the law. He said he would hold the law up while I tried to hold on to the people. He said we would lose some things and save others, and that our job was to make sure the right ones stayed. Ella picked me up at the curb because she said the walk looked longer from here than it did in my head. She had a sack with 2 apples and a bottle of water because she has learned to treat a day like a small hike. In the car, I told her about the petition and the hearing date. Her jaw set in that small way I remember from her debate nights when she was 16 and sure that logic could fix a room. She asked what we needed next. I told her the doctor letter and a witness statement and a night of sleep that took. She said we could get 2 out of 3. We drove past the house on the way back without meaning to. The porch light was on in daylight because someone had left the switch wrong, and it looked like a small mistake in a list of big ones. I counted my breaths and decided I would not stop. The hospital had told me to walk a little each hour. We parked near Washington Park and made a slow loop around the pond. Ducks cut thin lines through the surface, and a child tossed bread that floated uneaten because the ducks were uninterested in old bread when the water had more honest offerings. Ella did not hurry me. She matched her steps to mine and kept a running list on her phone of calls to make and letters to send and groceries to buy because people who teach children know lists are the ropes across a river. By late afternoon, we were back on her couch with a pad of paper between us. I wrote Mark's name and Dr. Brooks and recorder stamped in capital letters like I could anchor the day with ink. Ella started spaghetti, and the apartment filled with the kind of smell that makes you believe tomorrow is a thing you can reach. My phone buzzed once and then stopped. I did not look. The line between action and reaction is thin, and I wanted to stay on the right side of it. When we ate, neither of us spoke much. After the dishes were rinsed and the list was stuck to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a school bus, I stood at the window and watched the evening turn the street the color of a bruise that would heal. I felt tired down to the places muscle turns to thread. I thought of Linda and the way she would have run a hand over the plan and nodded and then found a better pen. I lay back on the couch and pulled the blanket up and listened to Ella put her lesson plans into a folder. The quiet was kind. Tomorrow had a shape. For the first time since the lock did not turn, I believed I might meet it standing. He said he would also add a note to the chart that communication should go through me or through counsel except in a medical emergency. The records window sat around the corner from the lab. The clerk wore a sweater with a small stain near the cuff and an expression that said she had seen every permutation of family and paperwork. I told her I wanted to update my HIPAA authorizations. She handed me a form and a pen and asked for my ID. I wrote Ella Turner under authorized to receive information, and I wrote Mark Johnson, attorney, under the same line. I left other names blank. I initialed the box that said revoke prior verbal permissions. The clerk read it over and stamped it with a sound that felt like a point made. She said going forward they would follow what was on the page. She said if anyone called without being listed, they would be told politely that they could not be helped. Her tone was gentle and definite at the same time. On the way out, I passed the gift shop, where Linda used to buy a crossword book, for whoever in our circle had been stuck in a bed. The display had a row of tiny plants in ceramic pots with painted faces. I almost bought one, and then I did not. A plant deserves better than a week on a windowsill while a man figures out where he belongs. Outside, the air had sharpened. I tucked the letter inside my coat, as if it were a small animal I was trying to keep warm. I called Mark from the sidewalk and told his assistant we had the letter and that I would drop a copy at his office after lunch. She said she would let him know and that he would draft the motion this afternoon. She asked me to scan and email if I could. I told her I would bring the paper itself because paper feels real to men who have spent their lives holding boards to the line. I walked to the bus stop and sat on the bench. A man in a knit cap asked if I had the time, and I showed him my father's watch. He said, "Nice piece," and I said, "It keeps me honest." The bus came and the driver nodded, and I dropped the coins and rode with my letter pressed against my chest. The route wound past the State House and the park, and the stretch of shops that sell things nobody needs except on the day they do. I got off near Mark's office and climbed the stairs slow. He met me at the door like he had been listening for my steps. He read the letter once, then again. He nodded the way a carpenter nods when a board sits flat. He made a copy and put the original back in my folder and said we were in good shape for the first volley. He said he would file the opposition and request that the court deny any temporary orders and that he would attach the letter my declaration and any witness statements we could gather by tomorrow. He asked me to stop by Karen White's shop for a sentence or two on her letterhead describing our transaction last week. He said it did not need to be fancy. It just needed to be true. I told him I would go there next. He asked how I felt. I told him like a man who has decided to keep breathing, even when the air has to fight to get in. He smiled and asked if I needed a ride. I told him I would walk. He said walking is good, as long as it is forward. Karen's shop smelled like damp soil and green stems. She looked up and saw something in my face and came around the counter before I could speak. I told her I needed a favor for a judge who would never meet either of us. She said, "Write it for me and I will sign if it is true." I wrote 2 lines on her pad. Last Thursday, Michael Turner placed and signed an order for 6 centerpieces. He read the invoice, corrected my mistake on the tax subtotal, and paid with a check he filled out himself. She read it and nodded and signed and pressed the shop stamp over her name and the date. She tore off the top sheet and handed it to me and pressed my hand between hers the way some people pray. On the walk back to Ella's, I passed the school where Emily had once played the clarinet badly and grinned anyway. The memory rose like a warm front against the cold of the day. I let myself feel it, because refusing a real memory does not make the hard ones any less loud. At the corner, I waited for the light and thought about the small network of people who had steadied me in 24 hours. A lawyer who sharpened pencils to a point. A doctor who chose caution and then clarity. A clerk who stamped a form like it mattered. A florist who told the truth on paper. A daughter who made space on a couch and in her heart, even after years of being the quiet one. When I reached the apartment, Ella was not home yet. The room held the warmth it had borrowed from the morning. I set the letter on the table and the witness note beside it and placed my father's watch on top like a paperweight from a life that had believed in clocks. I stood at the window and watched a woman drag a Christmas tree to the curb weeks late and thought about how people hold on a little too long and then let go fast. The letter in my coat said I was steady enough to steer. It did not say anything about the sorrow that sat just behind my ribs. That part would be mine to carry and to lighten as I could. The kettle clicked itself on when I tapped the switch, and I waited for the rumble that would mean water was ready for whatever came next. The door opened, and Ella stepped in with the tired shoulders teachers wear by late afternoon, and the bright eyes she keeps for the people she cares about. "Tea first," she said, shrugging out of her coat. She asked about the doctor, and I told her the visit went clean, the assessment straightforward, the letter strong. We moved to the table and the quiet settled between us. I said when her mother died, I went looking for her in the places that already looked like her, and I mistook likeness for virtue. I told her I kept giving the loudest room to the child who knew how to fill it, and I left my quiet one to build her own. She said she had learned young to make herself smaller, so the house felt bigger for everyone else. She said the day I taught her to sand a board smooth, she thought it meant we would finish the bookshelf together, and when I called Emily in to help pick the paint, she stood in the hall and memorized the way the grain looked in the light, because memory was what she could keep. I told her I was sorry, in a way that was not a word, but a thing made by the shape of my mouth and the weight behind it. I said I did not know how to repair what I had neglected, only that I wanted to try with whatever days I had. Ella said trying is a verb, and verbs count for more than adjectives. She stood and crossed to the hall closet and came back with a shallow tin, the kind old sewing kits come in. She said Linda called it a bundle of ifs. She said today felt like the right time because the choice had been made for us by locks and lists that were not ours. She slid the envelope toward me. It went on to speak of the house we built, and the rooms where our daughters learn to stand, and the way walls keep you honest about who you are. She wrote about Emily's strength and her need to steer, and about how those gifts can become weapons if they are not handled with care. She wrote about Ella's quiet and her stubborn kindness, and how those gifts can get trampled when too many boots walk the same hallway. She wrote that the house should remain with me for as long as I wanted to live there, and that upon my death or my choice to leave title should pass to Ella, who would know how to make a home without turning it into a prize. It was the signature of two women from church, Nancy Floyd and Ruth Allison, witnesses, to Linda's signature, and a notary block with a seal pressed deep enough to make the paper bend. She said Linda had called her to the kitchen and made tea and set the envelope between them and said, "Keep this until the day you know you have to." I told Ella we would let Mark see it first thing. I asked why Linda had not shown me this. She said Linda trusted me to be good, but she also knew me to be soft where Emily was concerned. I closed my eyes and saw Linda at the kitchen table with a pen, and that square of tongue caught at the corner of her lip when she concentrated. I saw her beckon Nancy and Ruth in from the driveway, with their arms full of tulips, and ask them to read and sign, and promise that they would be willing to say what they saw if it ever came to that. Ella asked if I was angry with her for waiting. I said she had done the hardest thing a person can do, which is hold back a lifesaver until the swimmer is actually drowning and not just splashing loud. I said my pride might have ruined this if she had given it to me, when grief still told me I could fix people by loving them harder. I said I would like to sit and watch the way her mouth moves when she reads, because it made me remember Linda reading library books aloud when the girls were small. When the light thinned, we put the papers back in the tin and set the tin on the top shelf in the hall for the night. I wanted it where both of us could see it, and neither of us would fuss. Ella packed her bag for the morning and slid the memorial letter and Karen's note into a folder labeled with a sticky tab that read Dad. The sight of my name in her careful teacher hand untied a knot I did not know I had tightened. We settled on the couch with the blanket over our knees and the sound of pipes whispering in the walls. The city made its evening noises beyond the glass. Somewhere a siren flared and fell. Somewhere a door shut with intent and then reopened with apology. I rested my head back and let the small facts of the day find their shelves. A letter with a seal. a daughter with a steady spine, a wife who had sent help from a year no longer attached to the calendar. The room seemed to breathe with us in and out, as if it had decided to make space for what we could carry and what we could not, and I let the quiet do its work. Mark waved me in before I reached the threshold, as if my steps had already announced themselves. He said this was not a full will, but it was a clear statement of intent, witnessed and notarized, and it would carry weight when a judge considered whose choices made sense and whose did not. He asked if Nancy and Ruth were reachable. I said yes. He told his assistant to schedule brief sworn statements and to scan the pages so copies could travel while the originals stayed safe. He had found a civil case from 2015 out of Macon County that named Jason as a defendant in a dispute over a pocket listing that had sold to a cash buyer for a price the seller later called laughable. He showed me a printout from the state site that we had already seen the citation for advertising, without written consent, then a copy of a broker newsletter from his firm last year that reminded agents that offers to purchase property without authorization violate more rules than a person wants to count. An email that had been forwarded 3 times and finally landed with someone Mark knew. $200,000. Cash only. Close in 10 days. 10% assignment fee baked in. My name did not appear. The property description said estate situation. He said we would send a preservation letter to the managing broker this morning. We would attach the recorder notice and the doctor letter. He handed me a copy. I thanked him, and he brushed that aside and poured coffee that tasted better than it had a right to. He nodded and told me to hold the beat. Jason gestured at the windows and spoke in that steady pitch he uses when he is selling certainty. Paint light, clear counters, remove personality. I saw his mouth make shapes that matched the price I had read in Mark's email. The photographer nodded and wrote a note. I thought of Grace at the window, and then on the phone telling me she kept our picture in her sock drawer, where no one could declare it clutter. I thought about what happens to a child who learns that her father puts numbers ahead of people and ahead of the room where birthdays lived. I imagined her at the science fair with her trifold board and Jason on one side talking about metrics and Emily on the other side talking about risks, and me in the audience trying to remember how to be a grown man who does not crumble. Not to post or to shame, but to remember. Then I called Mark and told him what I was seeing. He said he would copy the board and the title company Jason often uses and the buyer named in the email chain. My phone buzzed. Mark wrote that the letters were sent and that he had requested written confirmation that any marketing or work on the property would stop effective immediately. He added one line at the end that made my breath come easier. I sipped and watched the window gather steam and then clear. I put the phone face down and let the coffee do its work. She saw me and touched my shoulder in passing and ordered a grilled cheese and a cup of soup. They pass within reach and show their hands are open. The rug was no longer leaning by the tree. The handwriting was not Emily's and not mine. My phone buzzed a second time with a message that was not a message. Grandpa home. It trained something inside me to stand straighter than grief allows. I typed a reply. Tell her I saw the wish and I am working hard. Then I erased it because the phone was still Emily's, and I would not let a girl carry a conversation that should be between adults. I put the phone away and started back toward Ella's. On the way, I passed a storefront office with River City Holdings in frosted letters. The door was locked, and the windows held nothing but a ficus and a calendar flipped to last month. I wrote the name down anyway on the back of a receipt. Mark would want it. Things that can be checked and then cut to fit. Ella's apartment felt like a different city when I opened the door. The air held garlic and basil and the sound of a radio low in the kitchen. She glanced up and I held up the folder. She wiped her hands and we sat. I told her about the email chain and the truck and the photographer and the price. Her eyes went still the way water goes when the wind drops just long enough to show you the bottom. She said we would not be hurried into a loss dressed as help. She said Mark had called while I was out, and he would send the draft motion tonight. We ate spaghetti with the focus hungry people bring to a good bowl. After we spread the papers on the table again, and added the receipt with the name and the photos of the crew and the camera. Ella wrote a timeline in neat teacher printing. Hospital discharge. Locks changed. Civil standby. Doctor letter. Recorder notice. Linda letter. Witness note. Preservation letter sent. Crew observed. We looked at the line we had drawn and saw that it crossed more ground than a man notices while walking it. I went to the window and stood with my hands on the sill. The street was blue with the early winter hour that pretends to be night until the real thing shows up. I told Ella I was afraid of what would happen to Grace when the shape of her parents' certainties changed. Ella said children are stronger than we remember, and then she added that adults can be too. She said our job was not to spare Grace from truth, but to spare her from carrying weight that is not hers. She said we would show up for the science fair no matter what else fell. I nodded and turned back to the table and stacked the papers into a clean pile. My father's watch ticked on the wood like a small metronome telling us we had done enough for one day. I set it beside the folder and sat down. The room settled around us the way rooms do when they are holding more than two people can say out loud. We let the quiet work on our edges until they felt less sharp. Ella packed folders into her bag, slid the tin with Linda's letter into a tote, and said Mark wanted us at his office first, then the house. They would instruct any agent to hold all activity on the property pending clarification. He asked if I felt up to standing on my porch while we told my daughter and her husband that the work would stop today. When we turned onto my block, I saw the painting truck again drop cloths draped over the rail, and a ladder leaned against the eave like a warning. Emily stood on the porch in scrubs under a quilted vest, arms folded, as if the day were something to outlast. He greeted the crew foreman by name off the truck door, then told him calmly that any continued work today would be at his company's risk. He handed a copy of the preservation letter and the recorder notice to the foreman, then another to Jason. He explained that no court had granted any authority over me or over title that the property was flagged, and that any marketing or alteration would be reported to the board and to the carrier who insures the brokerage. He said he had verbal permission, and that emergencies call for decisive action. Mark said the board does not honor verbal in matters like this. She said I was making this harder than it had to be. She said the house was dangerous for me alone. She said she had spoken to professionals who agreed. I told her my doctor had written that I was managing my affairs and that I had taken my morning pills on time and walked without help from the curb. I said fear did not hand her a key that replaced mine. She said last Thursday, Michael came into my shop. He did not seem confused. He hung up and told his crew to gather the drop cloths. Emily said this was humiliating. She said neighbors would talk. I thought I had reached the height of feeling for the day, and then I saw Grace in the hallway through the front window, hair in a crooked ponytail, socks unmatched face pale as the winter sky. Emily moved to block the gap, and Grace slid under her arm and onto the porch like a person who has learned that small bodies can find small spaces. She ran to me and wrapped her arms around my waist and pressed her face into my coat. Please do not go. Please stay where I can find you. I put both hands on her shoulders and crouched slow until our faces were level. I told her I was right here now, and that I would be right there at her science fair, and that grown-ups were working out loud and on paper how to be better grown-ups. Emily reached for her. Grace held on longer than most hands would dare. Emily said this was not appropriate, and that we were upsetting the child. Karen stepped closer and said the child looked upset because the adults forgot who taught whom what home means. The foreman said they would store tools and return when the office told them. I asked for one thing. I asked if someone would bring out Linda's shadow box. Emily hesitated. Jason said inventory had to remain intact. Mark suggested a simple solution. Family memento placed in neutral custody for now. He offered his office. He said he would catalog the item and hold it until the court made orders. He said a compromise makes a better line to follow than a fight does. Emily looked at Grace, then at me, then at the box of camera gear by the steps, and then she nodded once, a small surrender that did not cost her pride. She went inside. I watched the open door like a man watches a horizon. While we waited, Jason tried to restart the performance. He said he hoped there would be no hard feelings, and that this was all a misunderstanding of urgency. Mark said the misunderstanding was legal, not emotional. He said we would resolve it formally. Jason said he would have his counsel call. Mark said his number had not changed. Emily came back with the shadow box wrapped in brown paper. She placed it in Mark's hands, as if handing off a part of her own story. For a second, her face changed. She looked like a girl who had fallen off her bike and could not decide whether to cry or laugh. Then the mask returned. She told Grace to go inside. Grace looked at me for permission, and I gave it, because the porch had enough weight on it already. Karen reached into her bag and handed me a small bunch of greenery tied with twine. Rosemary, she said, for remembrance. She said the shop had cut stems, and sometimes the leftovers needed a home. I held it, and the smell ran through me like a thread into cloth. Mark checked his watch and told Jason we were done here. He said all parties were now on notice. He said any further action would be met in court. He thanked the foreman and the photographer for their professionalism, and they each nodded in that careful way people do when they have been told to stop and are relieved. He tucked the shadow box under his arm like a book. We stepped off the porch and onto the walk. My knees felt their age. Ella reached for my elbow, and I let her hold what needed holding without apology. Behind us, the door closed and the chain slid, and the house looked like itself again for a breath. Karen headed down the sidewalk, scarf bright against the winter day. The crew loaded the ladder into the truck. The photographer put her camera in its bag and glanced at me with something almost like kindness. At the curb, Mark paused. He said we had accomplished what we came for. Work had stopped. Items had been preserved. The next step would not be on a porch. It would be on paper and in a room with a seal on the wall where sentences carry consequences. He asked if I was all right to ride with Ella. I said I was. He reminded me to eat something that was not worry. He left for his office with the shadow box and the law as his passengers. Ella and I stood by the car for a moment that lasted long enough to cool the heat in my face. She asked if I could manage a short walk at Washington Park before we went home. I said yes, because moving forward had become our only trick. We drove away slow. In the rearview mirror, the house sat with the porch light off in daylight again, which is how it should be. The street opened ahead of us. The trees on the median wrote a sentence across the sky that I could not yet read, but I felt its grammar settle in my bones. Ella carried the folder with the doctor letter and Karen's note and the copies of Linda's pages. Petitioners Emily Miller and Jason Miller. Respondent Michael Turner. The other lawyer said they were seeking a temporary guardianship due to concerns for safety and assets. Mark said he had filed an opposition with supporting documents and asked to be heard. I said my daughter and her husband had petitioned to take control of my person and my estate and that I was here to show I could manage my own life. She asked the other lawyer if there were medical records supporting the petition. He said there had been a recent hospitalization and that family observed confusion. The judge asked if a physician had opined to incapacity. He said, not yet. She asked why an emergency order should issue today in the absence of a medical opinion. Mark called Karen White. She said, last Thursday, Mr. Turner came in, placed an order, reviewed an invoice, corrected a tax subtotal, and paid by check. Karen said no. I said fear and control sometimes share a coat, and it can be hard to tell who is wearing it. The other lawyer stood and called his first witness. He said he understood. A man went to the hospital and came home to a lock that did not turn. He has since obtained a physician letter affirming his orientation and judgment. He has updated his authorizations. He has recorded a notice to protect title. Work crews have been stood down. He respectfully asks this court to deny temporary guardianship and to enter an order preserving the status quo. He asks that the petitioners refrain from listing, marketing, altering, or attempting to transfer the property. He asks that the parties be set for a status date and, if the court wishes, for mediation. Temporary guardianship is an extraordinary remedy. Today, there is no physician declaration of incapacity. There is a letter stating the opposite. There is testimony that the respondent is oriented and managing medication. There is also evidence that the petitioners engaged in steps toward marketing a home without legal authority. The court denies the request for temporary guardianship and any emergency orders at this time. The court further orders that there shall be no listing, marketing, staging, alteration, or transfer of the property known as the Turner residence, absent written consent of Michael Turner or further order of this court. The court sets this matter for a status conference 30 days from today. The parties are ordered to exchange any further documentation at least 1 week prior. The court encourages counsel to explore mediation. To the petitioners, the judge added future attempts to alter the status quo without authority may result in sanctions. He told us he would draft the proposed written order and email it to the other side for sign-off. He said he would send a copy to the managing broker and the title company as well. He said the board had acknowledged receipt of his letter. He said we would keep the shadow box in his office until a judge told us otherwise. He said that last part twice. Emily approached with her arms tight to her sides. She said this felt like betrayal. She said she had tried to keep me from falling down the stairs or forgetting a burner and setting the house on fire. She said she had been the one to sit in the hospital at 2 a.m. listening to the monitor beep. I told her I did not doubt her fear or her love. I told her locks and emails about assignment fees were the wrong tools for love. I told her she had a key to me that did not require a locksmith. Ella stood beside me and did not speak. Her presence was a sentence I could lean on. Jason joined her and said this was not over. Mark said he was right about that, but not in the way he meant. He said we would be back in 30 days with more paper and fewer surprises. He shook the other lawyer's hand, and then ours, and went down the hall with the steady stride of someone who knows which filings box holds the ink that sticks. Ella and I stepped out into air that felt new even though it was the same winter air as before. The sun had stretched a little higher, and the courthouse steps felt less like a climb. We stood there a moment and let our shoulders drop. Across the street, a man bought a pretzel from a cart and laughed at something the vendor said. A woman in a red coat hurried by with a briefcase and a grin. Life moved as it always does when a small storm lets go of its thunder. I put my hand on the stone rail and felt the cold through my palm and thought of Linda's letter and Karen's lilies and the way Grace's hand had pressed the window. Ella asked if I wanted coffee or something stronger. I said coffee would do, and we started down the steps together, one careful tread after another, toward a day that had room for more than fear. My phone buzzed, and Mark's name lit the screen. He said the managing broker had issued a stand-down in writing to Jason and to anyone else who had touched the file. He said the state board had opened an inquiry after his letter and the email chain. A second call came from a number I did not know. She said my authorizations had been updated and logged, and that any prior verbal permissions were revoked. Then she said that there had been access attempts to my chart from a device and account not listed. She said the hospital takes such matters seriously and that it would conduct an internal review. I called Mark and asked if today was wise. He said the order preserved the status quo and that as owner I had the right to be inside. He said he would meet us there with the shadow box. He installed a new lock and handed me 2 keys and dropped the third into Mark's envelope. Mark set the shadow box on the dining table and peeled the brown paper away. I told him it should stay. Mark saw it too and asked where Scout had gone. I said Emily had said she would rehome him. She had seen a note on the bulletin board at the vet 2 blocks down about a German shepherd found without tags near the park 10 days ago. Ella put the leash in her tote and said we would go after we finished the walk-through. Mark took a call and stepped to the porch. The managing broker had placed Jason on internal suspension pending the board review. Mark said the buyer LLC had replied to the preservation letter with a single sentence declining further contact. She said that the employee at issue had been placed on administrative leave pending review of compliance with patient privacy policies. Ella slid the shadow box a little closer to the spot where it had hung and said tomorrow. The board had acknowledged the complaint opening and assigned a number. He added that the Attorney General's Consumer Division had requested copies of the email chain for review. He said sometimes attention is enough to keep hands where they can be seen. The sound of that drawer sliding on wood was the same as it had been before, and that steadied me. I walked to the bedroom and stood beside the dresser. The wedding photo waited near the lamp. I lifted it and studied the younger versions of our faces. Linda's hair caught the light just so, and my tie sat a little crooked because she had kissed me while I was trying to straighten it. I set the frame back on the dresser and laid my hand flat on the wood and spoke her name in a way that did not require sound. I returned to the living room and sat on the edge of the couch. Scout rolled onto his side and sighed with the drama of a dog who believes his work for the day is done. Ella stacked the folders and slid them into her tote. She said tomorrow we make breakfast here. She said eggs and toast in our kitchen. She smiled, and it took the day's hard edges and rounded them enough for sleep to find a path. Outside, a car passed slow, and the driver looked at the house the way people look at places that remind them of something they cannot name. The porch light stayed off to honor a rule that had always felt right. The boards under my feet hummed a tired note of welcome. I leaned back and let the room hold me. The day had moved the story along without breaking it. My heart beat in a steady line behind my ribs. Ella folded a blanket and set it within reach. We did not need to say what tomorrow meant. It would arrive whether we announced it or not, and tonight the house was ours enough to rest. I toasted bread and set out the old plates that had somehow escaped the staging. After dishes, Ella held the shadow box against the dining room wall, while I measured with the carpenter eye that still knows true even when it shakes. Mark arrived late morning with papers. A new will that honored Linda's letter, a simple trust for Grace so no adult could touch what belonged to a child. A durable power for finances, with Ella, a healthcare power with Ella first, and Mark available to help if needed updated authorizations that matched what the hospital now had on file. Before he left, he said there were developments. The board had moved Jason's file from inquiry to formal investigation. The managing broker had put him on unpaid leave. Mark said none of this was mine to carry. I opened it to find Emily on the porch, with shoulders drawn up and eyes that had not slept enough. She asked if she could come in to talk. Emily said she had been placed on administrative leave pending a review. She said the hospital believed there had been an unauthorized access attempt to my chart. I told her locks and lies dressed up as urgency had turned our house into a stranger. I told her I believed she thought she was protecting me, and I also believed she liked the feeling of fixing things with speed and control. I said I would not press criminal charges. I said I would set clear lines. She said she would try. She crashed into my middle and said in one breath that her volcano model worked, and that the teacher said she had promise, and that she had told the class her grandpa would help her build a better base for the next project. After Ella graded spelling lists on the couch, while I sorted the small pile of mail Karen had gathered for me, there was a letter from the bank confirming a hold on account changes, a flyer for gutters I do not need, and a card from a woman who wrote that her husband had been approached with a too-fast offer for their home, and that Mark had given her my initials as someone who would understand. Ella and I tucked the bulbs into the old bowl and set them by the window the way Linda had. She pointed at a drawing of pressure and release and said in a clear voice that sometimes you have to let things out, or they will find their own way. Emily stood across the room, hands in the pockets of a plain coat, eyes rimmed red, watching. Mark reported that the board investigation was ongoing, that the managing broker had confirmed in writing that no agent would touch the property without my signature, that the recorder notice remained in place, that no emergency motions had been filed. The other lawyer said his clients would consent to mediation. The judge said good and set a date and told us to behave like people who had learned something. That night, Ella and I hung the shadow box back in its place. I stood back and told Linda in my head that we had not wasted what she left. I told her the house had been hurt, but not broken. I told her Ella had been the daughter who built the bridge and that I had finally learned to walk across it without looking down. Before bed, I sat at the dining table with a pen. I wrote a letter to Grace for her to read someday, when questions grow taller than answers. I told her that home is not only a roof and a lock. It is the people who refuse to let money name the rooms. It is the hand you put on a window when you need to make sure someone is still there. I folded the letter and put it in the tin with Linda's pages and the spare buttons, because some legacies want company. The house settled the way old houses do when night wraps around them. Scout took his place by the bedroom door. Ella turned out the lamp in the hall, and the darkness came in soft. Not the kind that hides, the kind that covers. I lay down and listened to the slow conversation of pipes and wind and memory. If this story reaches you and you feel that some part of it rings true, please like, subscribe, and share so others can find a steady hand and follow me for more stories like this.